Hey everyone, this is Bill, and welcome back to the channel. Lurking in plain sight in the political winds is an issue detrimental to property rights and investment real estate. Today we are traveling into some quicksand as we are addressing the political issue of rent control. This is an important topic, but before we begin, if you derive any value from today's video, we would appreciate you liking the video. And while you're at it, please consider subscribing to our emerging channel. We certainly would appreciate it. Okay, let's get to it. It is always stated, but the upcoming presidential election may indeed be the most important in over a century. Seemingly in the midst of a fourth turning, the country appears in a fight for its very survival as founded. From the national scene right down to the local community, so much is at stake. For property owners, the right to achieve full utility from your property may be significantly restricted by an overreaching and oppressive government. Governments attempting to encroach on property rights is nothing new, but we are without question in, what Ronald Reagan so eloquently noted, a time for choosing. First, let us drift back in time for a short spell. In 1912, Charles R. Van Hise, fresh off a stint as president of the University of Wisconsin, wrote Concentration and Control, perhaps bringing socialism to Madison. His work, with government central planning at the center, tried to rein in what he considered abusive private economic power through the implementation of government control. Within his work, Hise noted, quote, "The plan presented does not involve taking over property or its management, except securing to the public a reasonable price," unquote. Other than the market, who might decipher a reasonable price? If you have any ideas, please leave them in the comments section. Hise continued, quote, "Under the plan proposed, the industrial concentrations remain private property in charge of those who own them just as at present. Being granted the privilege of cooperation and restraint of trade, they are forbidden to take advantage of the public by charging unreasonable prices, and if forbidden so to charge, there must be some organism which enforce the prohibition. These conditions may exist during a hurricane if you are selling bottled water, but market dictation will punish landlords who charge unreasonable prices for rental units." Fellow FDR advisor Stuart Chase, an economist and MIT-educated engineer who is often credited with coining the phrase the New Deal, wrote a book in 1942 titled The Road We Are Traveling, Guidelines to America's Future. It is nothing more than a roadmap to communism. Chase describes System X, a new system of seemingly Fabian socialist government that would be achieved through the implementation of 17 points of action. With respect to this list, we will focus on number 17, quote, "Control without ownership," unquote. As stated, going back to the outline put forth by Charles R. Van Hise, this is not so much about ownership of your property, but through a series of regulatory action, restricting what you can do with it, and making sure that utility derived from the use meets a, quote, "reasonable criteria," unquote. Exactly who has legal claim upon the protection of your labor, I wonder? This brings us to the election before us. In publicly stated policy outlines, Democratic candidate Joe Biden has outlined plans for rent control and rent forgiveness. These objectives were recently discussed in an article in The Telegraph. In the Telegraph article, author Claire Trapasso stated presidential candidate Joe Biden supports mortgage and rent forgiveness for Americans who are suffering financially as a result of the coronavirus crisis. That would mean those who lost jobs during the pandemic wouldn't have to repay their missed housing payments. Quote, "There should be rent forgiveness and there should be mortgage forgiveness now in the middle of this crisis," quote unquote, the former vice president said. Forgiveness, he continued, quote, "not paid later, forgiveness. It's critically important to those who are in the lower income strata," unquote. Well, us landlords still have to make our mortgage payments, especially if we plan to retain our vitally important credit rating. It's not like COVID-19 missed our doorstep. Why are we left holding the financial bag? The article continued to state the Democrats' proposal could be a potential lifeline for struggling homeowners and renters, but it could also hurt small landlords who rely on rental income and ultimately result in higher taxes for everyone, say opponents of the idea. Progressive Democrat Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota introduced a bill last month that would cancel rent payments and mortgage payments for the duration of the public health crisis. Landlords and lenders would be eligible for compensation, but only if they agreed to renter protections for 5 years. However, it appears unlikely to become law. Several questions arise on this brazen attack on property rights. Are we referring to the health crisis of COVID-19? What if a vaccine is never discovered? Who will be dictating levels of compensation? What renter protections would be on the table? This proposed legislation would be an exercise in communism initiated by an enemy within, aiming through government interaction to eliminate free market capitalism. Caroline Glenn of the Orlando Sentinel wrote an article in October of 2019 noting, quote, "With Orlando rents averaging $12.17, lawmakers renew push for rent control and tenant protections," end quote. State Representative Anna Escamani, along with State Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, both Democrats of Orlando, have refiled a bill that, if passed, would restrict the reasons for which landlords can evict tenants, require landlords to provide leases and eviction notices in tenants' preferred language, prohibit evictions during a state of emergency, prevent landlords from charging exorbitant application fees and require them to refund fees when no units are available. It would also require landlords to provide tenants with 3 months' notice if raising the rents more than 5%, and protect renters who have been victims of domestic violence who receive federal housing vouchers from being denied housing, among other things. Smith says he believes there is a renters' right movement forming and more energy getting behind it. Quote, "Florida is such a landlord-friendly state," he said. "Our state and local laws are hostile to tenants." Locally, Jeremy Sisson is running against Anna Escamani for the State House in District 47. Unlike Escamani, Sisson has some cogent thoughts on rent control.
Some people tend to think that rent control is the answer, but I can assure you that it is most definitely not. Rent control or rent stabilization is government-imposed rent freezes on small, set percentage increases in which landlords are allowed to raise their rent on the units or complexes that they own. Now tell me, if you own an apartment complex, would you want the government telling you how much you could raise your rents in your building? Or do you believe that market factors and supply-demand equilibrium typically would sort that out naturally? As an expert in this industry, I can tell you that anyone who is proposing rent control as a solution to our housing crisis first does not fundamentally understand the housing and rental markets, and hopefully isn't sitting on any advisory boards offering these solutions. If rent control became the law of the land, you would see developers of all sizes pack up and head to greener pastures in other states like Georgia, Texas, or Arizona, just as a couple examples. I know this because some of our clients who develop multifamily projects told us just that very recently. So rent control would not only not solve the affordable housing problem, but it would make fewer regular market rate units available as well, since there would be less local development, which would exacerbate the housing supply problem.
If utilizing a rental property for a source of capital, the income approach to value comes into play. If rent levels are significantly below the current market rent levels, it can result in the subject property having a final value opinion below the true market value, thereby limiting the amount the owner can borrow and potentially affecting the rate. We currently have approximately 10% of our tenants well below the market rent levels. Annually, we raise the rent levels in the range of 6 to 10%, but we're really not gaining any ground. These are good people and long-term tenants, and we are comfortable with the current rates. However, should the government be successful in restricting our ability to raise the rental rate, we would initiate a rental increase to the market rent level prior to the passing of the legislation. We would take this action to avert the seemingly unintended consequences that would negatively impact our business operations. Among the potential issues is the inability to catch up to the market rent levels. Perhaps our costs rise, or we have an emergency where we need all available income to keep our business operational. Another issue arises as we seek to expand our holdings. Locked below market rent levels could well negatively affect our borrowing power, as we previously discussed. At the end of the day, we stand opposed to the Stewart-Chase system where government does not seek ownership of your property but enacts legislation to control what you do with it. Rent levels should be always dictated by market action. While the implementation of certain zoning provisions are certainly reasonable, bureaucratic rent control is something we will resist complying with. If we are required to do so, we will have some upset tenants who will likely be facing a move due to the inability to afford the new rental rate. We were all happy until government interaction, in an effort to help, ended up punishing the forgotten man.